There's still no war officially, but there is mobilization. That's the absurd reality created by the Kremlin. After the humiliating retreat of Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is calling up reservists to fight. 300,000 troops from all across Russia will be deployed. The extraordinary move breaks a 2 decades-long unspoken pact between the Kremlin and the Russian people. We do whatever we want on the international arena, while you can go on with your lives. As a result, Russians are panicking and buying up airline tickets en masse to get out of the country. Authorities have already warned that any protest would mean 15 years of imprisonment. But the threats don't end there. Putin has also made clear he's willing to use nuclear weapons if he must. Should his words be taken seriously, or is this just desperation? Will mobilization change the tide in the war in Ukraine?
So let's get to it. Will Russian mobilization change the tide in the Ukraine war? Let's begin with a quick fire round of 30-second each and pick up the conversation. Right after. Mr. Dupuy, please take the lead.
No, I don't think it will change massively the situation, because the situation has already changed a few weeks ago when the Ukrainian armed forces have relaunched their offensive capacity and regained more or less 8%, 9% of the territory, more or less 3,000, 4,000 square kilometers. What is new, of course, is the fact that there is a sort of schizophrenia diplomacy, schizophrenia position when it comes to Russian the decision. On one hand, he is saying everything is okay. There are not more than 6,000 dead, which was this is what Sergei Shoigu, Minister of Defense, said. And on the other hand, calling for the massive mobilization. Right. So it's a bit of awkward decision.
Schizophrenic, I like this term. We will continue from that point shortly, of course. Mr. Ehrlich, your take?
I believe that this will decisively change the course of the war. The reason that the Ukrainians were so effective in their advance in Kharkov was because Russian forces were stretched so thin and effectively were undermanned in opposing the Ukrainians. And now Russia is going to double the number of ground forces that it has in the arena. And really that lack of manpower has been the decisive factor, not Western support for systems like HIMARS. And so these forces aren't going to be the ones pushing forward. Rather, they're going to maintain a line of contact. And I think that what we've seen now is President Putin making a decisive decision in favor of mobilization when he'd previously been holding back.
And last but not least, Mr. Horodyskyy, your take?
I agree more with Emmanuel. This won't be a total game changer. First of all, it seems like an attempt to freeze the current situation and to freeze the current borders of Russian aggression. And yes, this will be a huge, massive of soldiers, but they will be unprepared. Their motivation is unpredictable, and definitely Ukrainians are also preparing. We're considering this as a big danger, and we are preparing.
And let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards, gentlemen. Mr. Ehrlich, I would like to begin with you. Does Russia have an army or armed forces?
Well, Russia has armed forces, but in the current conflict, its army has been what it's relied on the most, and it's structured its armed forces to be able to win a conflict without air supremacy. And that's part of why we've seen Russia fighting the way that it has. It's very consistent with Russian military doctrine. It simply hasn't had the manpower in the field to hold some of the territory that it's gained. And that's why I think that this is going to cause such a decisive change, a shift in the war. Russia has held back and sort of has had one hand tied behind its back because it hasn't mobilized. And now that it's mobilized, I think that it's unlikely we're going to see any further successful Ukrainian advances into territory that Russia has taken.
And Mr. Dupuy, is it no longer a special operation, as the Kremlin dubs it, or because we know the terminology is key here?
Well, let me rephrase that. It was never a special military operation, but a war did not say as well. A war which was not assumed totally.
Yeah.
I think, to respond to your question and to complement what my colleague said in the beginning, in 2008 there was a massive modernization, the will to modernize the Russian armed forces, and this, of course, is we are witnessing the fact that it may not have been so successful. First of all, there is massive military capability when it comes to the Russian armed forces, 700 more or less military forces in capacity to go abroad and to be motivated and to be activated. 150,000 were activated from the beginning, from the 24th of February. But of course, when it comes to the massification of the armed forces, it's a bit exaggerated to say that Russian armed forces can go up to 2 million of its soldiers. First of all, because the massive conscription has not been a reality yet, and of course taking in consideration the fact that having a massive demographic army does not make you a very high intensity, technologically capable army. Let's just compare what's happening a few weeks ago. Ukrainian forces are way less armed. Ukrainian forces are less 100,000 more or less armed forces, but yet they've managed to deter, and they've managed to put a lot of military pressure. More or less 10 to 15% of the military capacity of Russia is out of order.
So it's if we needed further proof that it's not what you have, but rather how you operate it. And obviously the announcement of mobilization was preceded by the announcement on referendums in 4 different regions in Ukraine. What are the prospects of them to pass? Are they reliable at all? And what will it mean in practice, Ivan Horodyskyy?
Yeah, about this referendum, it's a very tricky question, because first of all, no one in Ukraine won't be surprised of 99 or 100% support but so-called support. Of course, no one will believe in integrity of this referendum or in their due process, etc. And so from the political point of view, they won't be recognized by any country, except some Russian allies, North Korea or Cuba. Even Cuba, I think, won't recognize it. And from the legal point of view, they have no sense. Russia is saying about the right of nations for the self-determination, but there is no nation special, Zaporizhia nation, Kherson nation, or Donetsk nation. They all are Ukrainian nations, and even if they had some certain features, they have all the possibilities for their self-determination in Ukraine. So from international legal point of view, they will have no effect.
No effect, indeed, in terms of international law, but correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Ehrlich. If anything, NATO so far prevented Ukraine from operating in de facto Russian territory. If indeed passed, and the Russians at least will consider those territories Russian, will it give NATO a green light to greenlight a Ukrainian operation?
Previously, Ukraine has conducted raids and special forces attacks inside Russian territory in, for example, the Belgorod region, but they've done so discreetly. They haven't ever taken official responsibility for those attacks. The scenario that concerns me is now that domestically this could potentially be declared Russian territory, the means that Russia would be willing to use to defend that territory shifts. And so I'd previously warned that a Ukrainian attack attack on Crimea or an attempt to retake that peninsula was the most likely scenario to result in the use of nuclear weapons. And now we have the nightmare scenario that if Russia really truly treats these territories as its sovereign territory, that its nuclear doctrine would allow it to use nuclear weapons to defend those territories.
And Mr. Dupuy, to the big question of the triple WD, what would the West do? And if I may perhaps add a follow-up question to that, how can the international community help Vladimir Putin climb down this very high tree he's on at the moment?
Well, first of all, the narrative concerning the nuclear agenda has been flip-flopped by Vladimir Putin. At the beginning of the conflict, well, a few days before the conflict of the 24th of February, it was Sergei Lavrov saying, and in a way advocating or maybe summoning the international community, saying, do not bully on us because we are a nuclear deterrent nation. And yesterday, Vladimir Putin said the contrary, saying that Russia is under the threat of nuclear weapons coming from the NATO countries. So it's a way, again, to show or to showcase it's very, again, I would say it, very schizophrenic or very, let's say, contradictory diplomacy. On one hand, saying that it can use arms of mass destruction, and on the other hand, we have the reality of a conventional attrition of its capacity. So weak hand on one side and stronger hand on the other. Now, when it comes to arms of mass destruction, we're focusing a lot on nuclear capacity or nuclear threats. First of all, during the summer, there were some strikes on Ukraine, on Crimea, made by Ukraine on Crimea. I did not see a nuclear response of Russia. And the chief of staff, Ukrainian chief of staff, mentioned and showed pictures of an armed basis, Saki armed basis in Crimea, where more or less 15 jet fighters were destroyed. That's a huge blow. Or at the same time, the attack on the naval HQ in Sevastopol. And there was not a response, not more than a conventional response. Now, what is more threatening or more frightening, and this was in a way pinpointed by some of the discussions during the 77th General Assembly of the United Nations, is the other type of mass destruction weaponry. And we're speaking about a potential, possible use of chemical weaponry. What will we do if there is the use of chemical weaponry when we did not do anything when it was used in Syria?
Right. And Mr. Horodyskyy, in the short time we have left for the first part of the debate, what would be the Ukrainian move that will lead to victory? Putting a spoke between Putin and his militias?
You see, the issue of some coup d'etat in Russia, it's very seductive, but still in Ukraine, everyone understands that it is impossible in current Russia, or at least among current Russian elite. So the main move, we all believe in our armed forces. We have seen their successes under Kyiv and under Kharkiv, and we rely on them. So there are no public plans, but still we believe that they are main game changers.
Even Horodyskyy, Clint, Ehrlich, and Emmanuel Dupuy, you're staying with us. We're taking a very short break, but right after we will dive into what's happening in Russia, the domestic issues Putin is dealing with, perhaps. So a short break, and we're back with more.
Putin is doing nuclear gamble. He is using the nuclear element as part of his arsenal of terror. This is unacceptable. I think this shows very clearly to anyone in the international community who still harbored any doubts about his intentions, into what extent he is willing to go to advance and continue this illegal, unjustified invasion and aggression against Ukrainian people. Whatever confrontation or use of the nuclear weapons there would be, it would not affect only the territory where it is done. It would affect the whole territory of Ukraine, it would affect the territory of the European space, of the Asian space, and would have unforeseen consequences for the entire world. This is a very dangerous nuclear gamble, and the international community should be united in exercising the necessary pressure on Putin to stop such reckless behavior.
So let's get to it. Maybe those directives on behalf of Putin are not directed necessarily to the outside world, but rather back home. Is Putin losing ground in his home turf? Let's start with another quick fire round of 30 seconds each. Clint, Ehrlich, please take the lead.
Putin was losing ground due to the Ukrainian offensive because he had committed his reputation to what he dubbed the special military operation. This was a time of choosing, that he could have either backed down or he could have doubled down by pursuing mobilization. He chose the latter course. So I believe that what he's actually done is revived his political career by taking the measures that were necessary to ensure that Russia is able to hold on to the territory that it's acquired, and that by doing so, he's ultimately going to be seen as a decisive leader who did what was necessary for Russia.
Yes, wagging the dog, Russian version, if you will. Even Horodyskyy, your thoughts?
With Putin and with Russia, nothing is impossible. So we need, in any case, take this nuke danger seriously, very seriously. But still, we need to understand that Emmanuel mentioned Putin had and Russians had a lot of choices to use any weaponry, any army before during this war. They haven't. So anyway, it's a game, and we need to take it.
Yeah, to wait for the game changer. And Emmanuel Dupuy, your 30 seconds begin now.
Well, if I may paraphrase the French president, it's a very clear choice between war and peace, between a nation which has aggressed another nation and with the international community abiding by the Charter of United Nations, which is clustered with the Charter signed in 1945 in San Francisco. In one word, I think, and to add to what my colleague said, there's an unexpected consequence of what is happening in Ukraine, is that fire is everywhere on the border of Russia. In Armenia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan a few days ago, between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And Russia is no longer in capacity, nor has the will, or maybe the ability, to assure peace, security and stability in its close neighborhood, as the Russian always mention it.
Right, but the question remains whether because, not despite, but because of what's happening in Ukraine, Russia can allow itself to stay on defense and not chime into those multiple disputes we are seeing in the region, as you've accurately pointed out, Mr. Dupuy. And from this point onwards, of course, feel free to interact, dear panelists. So let's talk about the domestic scene. We're seeing many, or at least many reports of one-way ticket out of Russia in the hunt. Many Russians are trying to get their way out. Are we about to see a Russian exodus of sort? Yes, gentlemen, please.
I don't believe that we're going to see a Russian exodus. I think that there are certain members of the Russian elite and liberals who may leave the country, but that President Putin's base remains intact. I need to respond to this argument that I've now heard from both of your guests, suggesting that because Russian territory in Crimea, for example, was attacked and Russia didn't respond with nuclear weapons, that we can be assured that Russia will never do so. And that's simply contrary to Russia's nuclear doctrine, which reserves the use of nuclear weapons for conditions where there is an existential threat to the state. And so we would never expect Russia to use nuclear weapons in response to the scale of the attacks that we've seen. It doesn't mean that the nuclear option is off the table. If Russia were to face the loss of territory, like the loss of Crimea to Ukraine, that is the scenario in which nuclear weapons could come into play. And I think it's extremely foolish to imagine that it's simply an empty threat and not one that we should be very worried about.
Yes, and if we're paraphrasing philosopher David Hume would definitely agree, Clint, Ehrlich, the fact that the sun rose today doesn't mean that it will shine tomorrow as well. So if we haven't seen nukes so far, it doesn't mean anything about the future. But I'm blabbing here. Let's discuss what is still expected tomorrow. The UN Security Council debate on war crimes, on the question of how to prevent those who committed war crimes in Ukraine, how preventing them escaping prosecution. The Russian veto gridlock means what exactly, Emmanuel Dupuy?
Well, it means that at least on that point, or maybe again, Vladimir Putin has not achieved what he wanted, because there is unity, and this is very new, when it comes to the reform of the Security Council, which was not the case during the previous General Assembly. For the first time, United States and France are saying that they are abiding by the very consistent demand from merging countries, or sustained by Germany and Japan and Argentina and Mexico also, and India, of course, abiding by the fact that we should get rid of the veto process, because Russia and China are misusing or using constantly, but without any will to abide by the 11 chapters, again, of the United Nations Charter. I think what is important when we are dealing with the capacity to re-give an impetus or re-give a capacity for the multilateral system to be effective is, again, when it comes to the prosecution, the prevention, or the response to what seems to be, with very consistent proofs, scenes of crimes or war crimes. I'm not speaking about genocide, this is another issue. And I think during the last hours, at least during the speeches of most of the chief of state, there's a consensus that there should be responsibilization of those who have committed these type of actions.
And even Horodyskyy, the Ukrainian representative meeting a Russian representative, that might be taking place in the frameworks of this discussion?
No, because Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, has said very strictly that there won't be no meeting with Sergei Lavrov. So that's impossible scenario. Still in Ukraine, concerning the UN General Assembly meeting, everyone expects some resolutions concerning the support of special tribunal against crimes of aggression and establishment special mechanisms for reparations in case of Russia. I would not overestimate the effect of these resolutions, but still they are very important for the general community to recognize some issues, to recognize certain problems, and to make steps towards the justice.
And Mr. Clint, Ehrlich, in the brief time we have left, I would like to get your input on the South Lebanon Army outline. I'm sure you're familiar with it. We will declare you a traitor, but then we will immediately offer remorse, meaning spend 1 year in jail, and then you get out and it's all not forgiven, but forgotten, or rather forgiven and not forgotten. Can this moment of last-minute salvation be created for Russian troops now on the ground?
I don't believe that that's possible. I believe that Russian troops and that the commitment that President Putin has made means that that's simply infeasible, and frankly, there's no way to de-escalate the conflict.